Hi, and welcome to Springvale Seventh-day Adventist Church. We're glad you have joined us today, and we hope you enjoy the following message.
It's a privilege to be here today, to come and worship in this church. My first memories of this place would have been probably late 80s, early 90s. Don McFall revivals were in Melbourne. Three Afro-American pastors had come out from the US to evangelise people. So they were in the southeast, the northwest, and I think the west. And Springvale Church was chosen at that time to be sort of the epicentre of the southeast. I've got to say that the church is looking very dapper. It was a little bit different back then, but it's nice to be able to come here into a nice church with heating, which this would be great in summer too. You've got air conditioning as well. So some of you guys might know my mum, Irene Karaoglanis, has been here not long ago. In fact, my wife, Tanya, shared her experience here. I was probably about 2 years ago, Tanya. David Flory thought it was 3 weeks ago, but then again. Today, I'm going to share a story with you that you're familiar with, the story of the Good Samaritan. But you are going to hear it in a way that I'm sure you've never ever heard before. Who likes getting into the Word? Who here loves the Word? When I share this with you, there's going to be a narrative that's actually embedded there that came alive to me as I was reading through it one day. And it came about, and I'll explain that to you because of a direction that Jesus was talking about. So I hope you've got your Bibles with you today. It's going to be a really, really exciting experience as we get into the Word. So I would love for you to open up in Luke chapter 10. Luke chapter 10. Bibles, iPhones, dreaded Android phones are okay if you must. And we're going to be looking at verses 25 through to 37. And I'll start on 25. And it says, on one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? What is written in the law? He replied. How do you read it? He answered, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbour as yourself. You have answered correctly, Jesus replied. Do this and you will live. But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbour? In reply, Jesus said, a man was going from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and he went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road. When he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to this place and saw him, passed on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he travelled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him, bandaged his wounds, pouring oil on the wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense that you may have. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbour to the man who fell to the hands of the robbers? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus told him, go and do likewise. So who here has actually heard that story before? The Samaritan is synonymous today with doing right and helping the underprivileged. Are you aware that we actually have an act in Victoria called the Samaritan Act? Has anyone ever heard that? Does anyone know actually what it is? Oh, I know you're thinking about it. Okay. So just quickly, my family background is managing hotels, 5-star and the like. One of the things when we finish a function, there's often a lot of food left. And so typically what we had to do, it either went down to the staff canteen, but it was thrown out. And the reason it was thrown out was because you couldn't guarantee that the food wouldn't go off over time. What that meant was for poor people or underprivileged, they weren't getting that food. Restaurants and hotels wanted to be able to donate it, but under health legislation they couldn't. So this was a problem that was seen, I think, probably 3 or 4 years ago. It had been known for a long time. So the Victorian Parliament came up with the Samaritan Act. So long as the institution donating the food could guarantee that there was proper food handling laws kept, they could actually donate that to the underprivileged, hence the Samaritan Act. And it's, out of that, isn't it a fascinating thing? Thousands of years later, still happening. So we're going to look at verse 25. And in here was a trick question. It says, on one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Who was the expert in the law? Pharisees. Pharisees were the expert in the law. And it was interesting that this Pharisee said, what did he call Jesus? Or teacher. So what was he in effect saying to Jesus? What was he recognising him as? As a Pharisee. It was equal. This is really, really important. So let's have a look. Does anyone know what the definition of Pharisee is? So when we actually look it up in the dictionary, it's from the Hebrew word pushim, meaning a detached one or one that is separated for life of purity. It can also mean a self-righteous, sanctimonious person. Who has met a few Pharisees in their life? And they ain't all believers. Because there are a few people who are sanctimonious and self-righteous. We elect them. So let's notice Jesus' response. And there's a little bit of wordplay here. He says to the Pharisee in verse 26, what is written in the law? He replied, how do you read it? There's a saying in business that says, he who asks the questions controls the conversation. So Jesus was taking control. The Pharisee knows fine well what the law says, but Jesus was also reaching into the application of the law. This is really, really important. It's one thing to know something, it's another thing to be able to do it. And in verse 27, he answered, love the Lord, your God, with all your heart, with all your souls, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbour as yourself. This is really, really important because this is where the Pharisee and Jesus was referencing. First one was Deuteronomy 6:5. It says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. And Leviticus 19:8. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbour as yourself. And it finishes off with this, I am the Lord. When we hear that, when he says, I am the Lord, what does that mean? Who is he saying who he is? I am? How important is that in our faith? Who is the I am? God. So when he said this, this is like a seal that goes down on it. It's a command. But in verse 20, where am I? Got all excited. Okay, in verse 28, Jesus says, you have answered correctly. Jesus replied, do this and you will live. Verse 29, this is really interesting. But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbour? Now he should know already who his neighbour is. Justify himself. This is really interesting. It's amazing the lengths that some people will go to want to justify themselves. And the dictionary has this to say, just to put it in context. It's to defend, explain, clear away, or make excuses by reasoning, or let off the hook. Now, I used to justify myself a lot when I was at school why I didn't have my homework in. We didn't have a dog at the time, so I had to be really creative as to what ate my homework. And people can see when people make excuses. Who's seen politicians, and I'm picking on politicians here because I assume no one's a politician in this room, right? They get a lot of airplay. But when something is clearly wrong or a mistake has been made, have you ever found that they just keep redefining things or they just don't answer the question? How much respect would we give to someone who would just say, you know what, I did what I thought was right based upon what I knew, but we made a mistake? Who could live with that? If you heard a politician or someone in authority just say, you know, we were trying to do the right thing, but we made a mistake. What would we think of that person? Would we respect them? We would. That's not what this guy was doing. He was using one excuse after another. And this is the response, and it says, and who was my neighbour? So when the Pharisee said, the Pharisee said, and who is my neighbour? Jesus had some fun here because the context for the neighbour would most likely have been a fellow Jew. But Jesus reversed it. He made the Jew a victim, and the neighbour was, who was the neighbour in this story? It was a Samaritan. We must understand what was going on here. Because to be saved back in those days, you had to be healthy, wealthy, and Jewish. Do you understand that? We heard leprosy mentioned before. You know, the leper colonies. Does anyone know how bad that actually was in biblical times? That if you came to anyone and you had leprosy, you had to yell out, unclean, unclean. So they didn't come near you. What would the context of today be? Stinky armpits, stinky armpits. Could you imagine going around telling people, don't come near me, I've got really bad BO? You just wouldn't do it. But back then, it was total separation. And that's how the Jews looked at the Samaritans. Let's give context. The Samaritans and the Jews hated each other. My dad's Greek. I grew up with stories from my dad's island of Lesbos. My grandparents were telling me, you can see Turkey from Lesbos. My grandparents were born at the turn of last century. So they had lived through, and my great-grandparents' occupation for over 400 years by Turkey. And on their island, in particular, a lot of bad things happened. Really, really bad things. And it happened over a sustained period. The antipathy between the Greeks and the Turks, especially back then, was really, really strong. That's what we're talking about. We look at what's happening in the Middle East today, between the Sunnis and Shiites. People can't remember where it began, but it continues. That's what we have here. And so this has been going on forever. And in verse 30, in reply, Jesus said, a man was going from Jerusalem to Jericho, and when he was attacked by robbers, they stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and he went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, he passed on the other side. Now this is where the story gets really exciting. And let's examine what Jesus actually did in this scenario. He said, in Jesus' story, they were going from Jerusalem to Jericho. Let's give you some context here. The distance between Jerusalem to Jericho is about 27 kilometres. So what's the distance from, say, Springvale to the city? Does anyone know? Yeah, give or take. Maybe Dandenong to the city. So it's a fair distance. People get puffed out walking to the mailbox today. So they're used to it. It had an elevation of 2,500 feet. Okay, so who's ever been to the top of the Dandenong Mountains, to the lookout? Yeah? Who's ever tried walking up Mountain Highway? I see the guys riding their bikes, and they're like, yeah, and they're all over all the lanes. So the cars are going slow on the bikes, and the bikes aren't going very quick. So that's 1,000 feet. So imagine 2.5 times that height. That's what we're talking about here. It was through rocky desert terrain, and it was a natural hiding place for robbers and thieves. Right? So who has ever been through a place and it's like in the city you walk around, it just doesn't feel right? Yeah, imagine walking through a place like that. No streetlights back then either. But that's not the real story. This is where the story, as I was reading this years ago, I asked myself this question: why did Jesus say this the way he did? When you give someone direction, if someone said to you, how do I get to the city from Springvale? Who's ever driven that before? From Springvale to the city? When you give someone directions, are you intentional about it, or you just don't care? You're intentional. Who's ever been to another country where you don't know where you're going? Yeah. That's what it's like. It's like, where am I going? I remember going to Kuala Lumpur. Has anyone ever been to Kuala Lumpur? Man, I thought, I'm going to hire a car and drive. I get there, and I see the traffic, and I'm seeing the roads everywhere, and I'm going, you would have to be suicidal for me, a guy from Melbourne, to drive over there with 50 billion motorbikes and cars going everywhere. So I just got into a taxi, and yeah, that was much easier. Jesus was intentional. Let's read what he said. What direction were they going? What does it actually say? He said they were going from Jericho to Jerusalem. Okay, so where were they going? Did he say from... No, that was from Jerusalem to Jericho, wasn't it? Had they been going from Jericho to Jerusalem, what's that Jerusalem? Why would the priest and the Levite be going to Jerusalem? What is in Jerusalem that they would be going to see? Temple. Okay. The temple was there. When they entered the temple, especially a priest, a high priest, or a Levite, does anyone know what a Levite is? We're not talking jeans. We are talking the guys that helped the priests. They were separate. So, if they're going to the temple, what is really important about going to the temple? Sorry? Worship? Yeah? Could the priest just roll in any old time to the Holy of the Holy Holies? What did you have to do to enter the temple? Prepare yourself? Yes. What else? That's it. Cleanse. When a doctor goes into surgery, does he go, pick my nose and do this? Or what does he do? Washes himself. Okay? When you go to eat, what do you do? Okay. Can anyone click onto why Jesus gave the direction he did? He didn't say from Jericho to Jerusalem. What did he say? Jerusalem to Jericho. What changed? They didn't have to be ceremonially clean. Let's understand the significance of that, because they would have understood this implicitly. He took away every excuse for them not to tend to their fellow Jew. This is really, really important. This is the tipping point in this story. We must not miss what this actually means, because as Seventh-day Adventist Christians, right, Jesus is saying the same thing to us. We have responsibilities. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. Verse 32, so to a Levite. When he came back to the place, he saw him and passed by on the other side of the road. So when you walk on the other side of the road, what in effect are you doing? Who's ever been on a road where there's like an angry dog on one side of the road? I've been bitten by a dog when I was a kid. It was a greyhound, bit me on the arm. So when dogs are barking and they look angry, do I want to scratch their ears or avoid them? Yeah. Or who's ever been walking down the road and there's a few unsavoury fellows on one side of the road? Who wants to walk past a whole bunch of unsavoury people? Especially if they look angry or something. We want to avoid it. Also, if you don't want to look someone in the eye, you turn your head the other way, you whistle, and you pretend you don't see them. So this priest and Levite were pretending they didn't see this guy, one of their fellow countrymen. And let's have a look what happened here. In verse 33, but a Samaritan, as he travelled, came where the man was. When he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave him to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. A Samaritan, hated by the Jews and seen as inferior, they were racially vilified. Do we understand that? They were racially vilified. Here's something else I want to consider is when Christ died on the cross, and we understand that in the temple the curtain was ripped from top to bottom. The work that was the sole domain of the Jewish nation to evangelise, to spread the word, now went to whom? The Gentiles. Could it be that this story was the beginning of Jesus telling the Jewish people what was going to happen? Could it be that Jesus was pointing forward to the work that belonged to his people to take care, to minister, even their own and others, was now moving somewhere else? It's not implicitly written, but as I've read through this time and time again, it occurred to me that we are seeing the beginning of a change. The Samaritan, he took pity on him. His heart was affected by what he saw, even though the victim was a Jew. I knew a guy years ago who came to Glen Huntly. His father fought at Gallipoli. He was on the beaches, and he wasn't much of a believer. And in the middle of the battle, he thought he was going to die. And John was the name of the guy, tell me it was his father. His father looked up to the heavens, and he said, God, he goes, if you are real, he goes, I need you to show me that I'm going to live through this. And a pigeon flew down through all the hail of bullets, and it flew down, and he put it in his inside pocket, and that bird stayed with him till the battle was done. And there was a change in his heart. Later on, they went to France, and they were ordered to take no prisoners because they needed to advance. And as they were advancing, they were fighting the Germans. And he'd got out a fair bit ahead. The Germans were in trouble in the particular theatre they were operating in. And he goes, as he was advancing forward, he was a fair bit forward of everyone else. John was telling me that his father had shared this story, that he had seen this or heard this German guy, and he was in distress. He knew he was going to die, but he heard him singing a hymn in German. He was familiar with it in English. He knew the tune. And he said to him, I don't know if you understand me. He goes, we are to take no prisoners. I'm to kill you. cover yourself and remain quiet and I'll let you live. They were mortal enemies at that stage. Two soldiers in the heat of battle, advancing on each other. And yet Christ took hold of his heart, just like the Samaritan here. He took pity on him. He then bandaged his wounds, pouring oil and wine. Does anyone understand what the significance of that is? Pouring the oil and the wine? They were the first aids. They were St. John's first aid kits of the day. Now, Greeks have known for eons the importance of olive oil, not only to consume, but what it does on the body. Dr. Fiona Wood, has anyone ever heard that name? She got an AO. After the Bali bombings, when you saw, who remembers the Bali bombings? Yeah, who remembers seeing the burns and all that sort of stuff? Dr. Fiona Wood, she was operating out of Darwin. She was based in Western Australia, but she's a scientist. She had discovered there's a compound in olive oil that when it's actually put on the skin, the body recognises it as its own. And she had led research in this area, and so that's what she was doing with some of the burns. Now, I don't know if she just went down to 7-Eleven and picked up olive oil and did this. I'm sure it was more than that. But here's the thing. When God creates stuff, he knows what's in it. Gethsemane. You're going, why am I going to say Gethsemane? Does anyone know what the word Gethsemane means? It means olive press. So when Jesus went to the Garden of Gethsemane, what was to come out of him was to balm and heal us as well. He then put the man on his own donkey. What's significant about that? What he did is he took something personal. This guy would have been snotty and bleeding and a total mess because it said he was half dead. Now, just put it in a modern context. Understand David Florey has the nicest car in this whole church. Nice interior, beautiful. Imagine for you in your car if you had seen someone beaten up on the side of the road and they're a mess and they defecated. Because that's what normally happens. I've been on a lot of trauma sites in the business I run. The body, to protect itself, will let out all fluids to protect the brain and the heart. So atypically what happens is people vomit because the body has to get rid of it. They defecate, everything comes out and they urinate. It's ugly, that's the reality. And this guy has gone, I'm going to lift him up, I'm going to put him on my donkey. That was like his version of a car. Who here would like to put someone who's bleeding, snotty, defecated, vomited on their car, on their leather seats? Who would like that? Yeah. But that's the reality of it. And that's what he did. He made it personal. And he took him, and he was like an ambulance to him. And he brought him to an inn and took care of him. The Samaritan made sure that he had a roof over his head and a bed to rest on. And it became even more personal to the Samaritan. Let's read in verse 35. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. So I'm looking up denarii. We've heard that term, the denarii, in the Bible. So me being me, my wife will vouch for it, I have to know what it is. So I went looking for denarii, and it's the equivalent of 2 days' wages. In an Australian context, I went to the ABS and had a look. And in our money, it would be the equivalent of $400. Right? Now, if you're a multi-millionaire, it may not seem like much, but it was $400 to someone he didn't even know. And said, here's $400. The Samaritan was a man of means, just like us. He had first world resources. Can I ask you a question? Did this money or his wealth make him compassionate or generous? Was it his wealth that made him compassionate or generous? It wasn't, was it? Yeah. So what else was in this man's heart? He gave instructions to the innkeeper, look after him, and then he said, I'll reimburse you for any expenses you may have. Was there a cap set on his compassion or his generosity? Did he say to the innkeeper, okay, I'll only spend up to $400 and that's it? What was there a limit? Nothing. He put no limit. This is Now, that's actually a really, really good point, and that's one I hadn't considered before. So when I put this into my notes next time, I'll reference you, and then the time after that, I'll say, I've always said this. So you get one mention. It's the next time I share this. That's true. So, and this is a really, really interesting thing. I get called out lots of times to do work, floods, I see everything. And people are very, very generous with contacting me because they have a mate or a friend who's something, but they want me to wear the cost. Is that fair? You can't be generous with someone else's money. Generosity begins with what you're prepared to offer. And that's what was happening here. You might say, oh, it's okay for him because he had a lot of money. So let's change our minds. Let's change it. Instead of looking back at the Samaritan, let's imagine, and we go to the same part of the world today. Let's go to Syria. Okay, as we're well aware in the news, Syria has been bombardment. People haven't got anything. And people who are destitute, they've got nothing. And we'll look in Mark 12:42 to 44. This is context. It says, but a poor widow came out and gave 2 very small copper coins worth only a few cents. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she gave out of her poverty, put in everything, all she had to live on. So today it could be a grandma in war-torn Syria, in a city that's been blown to pieces. And based upon what Jesus has said, that people will be generous, doesn't matter where they are in life, because that's who they are. So location, status, wealth or poverty is no barrier to compassion or generosity. And in summary, I'll leave the final words to Jesus, because this is really important. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbour to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus told him to go and do likewise. Amen.
Thank you for joining us. For more messages, information on upcoming events and church services, please visit our website at www.springvale-adventist.org.au.